The first words that left my grandson's mouth that day still echo in my ears like a whisper from fate itself. "Grandma." He tugged at my hand with those small innocent fingers. "Look under the table." At first I thought he was simply playing, maybe hiding a toy or trying to show me some childish secret that only he could find amusing. But his wide eyes weren't playful. They were urgent, almost frightened, and in that moment, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "I'm truly thrilled that you're here. If you're watching this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening to my revenge story from. I want to know how far this story has traveled and how many hearts it has touched with its power." We were at my son's wedding, a day that was supposed to be filled with laughter, flowers, and blessings, but for me, it had already been heavy with shadows. I had felt it the moment I stepped into that grand hall decorated with golden drapes and white roses. Something wasn't right, though I couldn't yet name it. And then came my grandson's warning, small lips trembling as if he knew something I didn't. Slowly, I bent down, my old knees protesting, and lifted the cream-colored tablecloth. What I saw beneath made my heart stop cold. I won't tell you everything at once because stories like these must be peeled like an onion, layer by layer, each more bitter than the last. But I'll tell you this, what I saw under that table was the beginning of the end, not just for my son's wedding, but for the lies that had poisoned our family for years. My grandson, that little boy with his father's eyes but my spirit's fire, had unknowingly opened the door to a truth I had long suspected but never dared to face. And once the truth steps into the light, it demands blood, justice, or both. You must understand who I am before you can understand why this story matters. I am not just a grandmother in her fading years, content with rocking chairs and knitting needles. No, I am a woman forged in fire. A woman who has buried friends, enemies, and even love. I am the keeper of memories that others wish I would forget. But my mind is sharper than a knife, and my heart remembers every wound carved into it. My son, the groom that day, had hurt me in ways only a child can hurt a mother. Disobedience, betrayal, pride that drowned out gratitude. Yet, as mothers do, I forgave him time and again, hoping he would change, hoping he would remember the values I raised him with. But instead he chose power, money, and deceit. Still, I swallowed my bitterness because he gave me the one treasure I could never reject, my grandson. That boy was my light in the growing darkness, the only reason I endured his father's arrogance. So there I was, in a hall filled with music and fake smiles, watching my son marry a woman whose beauty was as sharp as broken glass. She was dressed in ivory silk, her face painted with happiness for the world to see, but behind her eyes I saw calculation. She didn't love my son, no, she loved his wealth, his status, the empire he thought he had built with his own hands. But I knew the truth. I knew the dirty secrets hidden in the walls of his success, and I also knew that she was part of the rot. And as I stared at her walking down the aisle, I prayed silently for my grandson's innocence, that he would not be tainted by the sins of his father. But prayers are fragile things. They shatter easily in the storm of fate. And that storm began to howl the moment I lifted the tablecloth. Beneath it, hidden from the joyous crowd, was something that didn't belong at a wedding. Something that turned my blood to ice. I remember gasping so loudly that my grandson pressed his little finger to his lips, begging me not to make a sound. He understood, though he was too young to understand fully. That was when I knew. This was no accident, no child's imagination. This was a warning. I straightened myself slowly, my knees shaking, my fingers clutching the edge of the table as though it might keep me from collapsing. My eyes swept the hall, scanning faces, looking for guilt, for secrets. And I saw them, two figures seated not far from the bride, whispering into each other's ears like snakes in the grass. They thought no one was watching, but my eyes, sharpened by decades of survival, caught every movement, every stolen glance. And in that moment, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. I leaned down to my grandson and whispered, "Don't tell anyone yet. Grandma will take care of this." His little head nodded solemnly, as if he trusted me more than anyone else in the world, and perhaps he was right to, because once a woman like me sees the truth, there is no turning back. Revenge is not a choice, it becomes a destiny. And that day, at my son's wedding, destiny pulled up a chair at our table and waited for me to make my move. I waited until the ceremony began, my heart hammering in my chest, because any rash move now would ruin not only the wedding but also the delicate thread of justice I was about to weave. I watched my son, the man I had raised from a stubborn, reckless boy into a self-assured, entitled groom, smile at his bride with a confidence that sickened me. He had no idea that the cracks in his perfect world were already forming, invisible to everyone else but glaringly obvious to me. My grandson sat beside me, fidgeting in his tiny suit, eyes darting between me and the table, silently urging me to act. I gave him a small, reassuring nod. He understood, and in that understanding, I felt a surge of protective fury. The ceremony dragged on, each word of the officiant a thin veil over the tension growing like a storm cloud in the room. I kept one eye on the couple, the other on the two figures I had spotted, the whisperers under the guise of polite family guests. Something in their body language screamed of betrayal. I could feel it in my bones. They were the key to a secret that could shatter everything. I didn't know yet what the secret was, but instinct and experience had taught me that it would not be small, and it would not be clean. These people, these predators dressed in silken smiles, had been planning their move for months, maybe years. As the vows were exchanged, my mind worked faster than I could blink. I thought about all the times I had been forced to swallow humiliation for the sake of appearances, all the lies I had been told to keep the family image intact. This was the moment when appearances would meet reality, and I would not let anyone else suffer the consequences of my son's carelessness. I had learned long ago that revenge is an art, not a tantrum. It must be precise, calculated, and unrelenting. And now, watching the bride's false affection for my son, I knew the time had come to start the masterpiece. After the ceremony, the hall erupted with applause. Guests showered the couple with blessings, and I followed them to the reception, pretending to be just another proud grandmother. But every smile I gave, every congratulatory word I uttered was a mask. My eyes never left the bride and her accomplice. I could see the subtle exchange of notes, the brushing of hands, the secret glances. They believed they were invisible. But the universe has a way of revealing hidden things to those who are patient enough to watch, and I had all the patience in the world. Later, when the couple moved to the dance floor for their first dance, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A small envelope fell from the bride's clutch, slipping silently to the floor. She didn't notice, and the accomplice whispered something to her, glancing around to ensure nobody else saw. My fingers itched to grab it, to tear open the lies it contained, but I restrained myself. That envelope was my opening, my weapon in the battle to come. I would wait, as any master of vengeance would, for the right moment to strike. Timing was everything. One wrong move and I would ruin not only my plan but the very justice I sought. I leaned down to my grandson and whispered, "Stay close to me. Watch but don't speak." He nodded, eyes wide, understanding the gravity of what was about to unfold. Children often see more than adults give them credit for, and this little boy had just seen the first flickers of betrayal in his young life. It was not his fault, and I would protect him from the shadows of deceit that were creeping toward us. But I also knew that the truth would have to be revealed, and sometimes even innocence must witness it to survive. As the evening progressed, the whispers grew bolder, the movements of the accomplices more desperate. They had no idea that I had been watching, calculating, memorizing. I knew every route they took, every glance they stole, every small suspicious gesture. And I began to plan the sequence of revelations that would leave them exposed, humiliated, and powerless. Revenge is a delicate tapestry, and I intended to weave it with the precision of a surgeon. Dinner was served and laughter filled the air, but I tasted only bitterness. My son laughed, oblivious, his bride by his side, smiling with practiced joy. I sipped my tea slowly, pretending to enjoy the event while my mind raced ahead, planning the moves that would undo the intricate web of deceit surrounding my family. I felt my grandson's small hand squeeze mine, reminding me why I must act, not out of malice but out of justice. He was innocent, a pure light in a dark world, and I could not let him be tainted by greed, lies, and betrayal. By the time the speeches began, I was ready. I had noted every word, every gesture, every slip of the tongue that could betray their intentions. I could see it all forming like pieces of a puzzle, each revelation carefully placed to ensure the maximum impact. Revenge is not just about anger. It is about teaching a lesson that will echo in the hearts of those who dared to deceive. and I was ready to teach, quietly, patiently, and with the wisdom of a lifetime spent observing human weakness. As the evening wore on, the lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the reception hall. The music swelled and softened in waves, but my ears caught only the whispers, the subtle movements of those who thought themselves clever. I had observed them long enough to know how they operated, how they tried to manipulate, and how they underestimated the quiet patience of a grandmother who had survived more than most could imagine. My grandson, sitting quietly beside me, seemed to sense the tension too, his small fingers clinging to mine, his wide eyes darting between me and the figures whose intentions were poisonous. I whispered again, "Watch but do not interfere. Everything will unfold as it must." And unfold it did. Just as the bride rose to give a toast, her hand trembling slightly, either from nerves or guilt, I saw the accomplice lean closer, murmuring words that carried the weight of secrets. They were careless, their confidence making them sloppy. The bride's hand brushed against the envelope she had dropped earlier, and I saw it. My heart clenched as I realized this was my moment to begin weaving the strands of truth into the web that would entrap them. I did not move yet, for haste could ruin the effect. Patience, after all, is the silent ally of vengeance. The bride began speaking, her voice sweet and melodious, but her words carried undertones that were unmistakable to me. She was thanking friends and family, but there was an undercurrent of condescension aimed squarely at my son. I remembered the years he had worked tirelessly to build his life, the nights he had sacrificed sleep for ambition, and the moments he had allowed pride to blind him to the dangers around him. And yet here was someone seeking to exploit every weakness, every misstep, to claim what was never hers. I tightened my grip on my grandson's hand, silently vowing that justice would find them before they could destroy the family I loved, even if the son himself could not see it yet. After her toast, she sat down, and the accomplice made a small motion toward the envelope. That was when I acted, ever so subtly, shifting in my seat to create a vantage point. My eyes never left the pair, noting the way they leaned toward each other, how their hands almost brushed over the incriminating paper. I could almost taste the fear that would come later, the realization that their careful plans were about to unravel. And my grandson, wise beyond his years in that moment, whispered, "Grandma now." I shook my head gently, reminding him that the perfect trap requires precision, and precision requires patience. Then the unthinkable happened. My son, oblivious to the storm gathering at his own table, clinked his glass to announce a surprise for his new bride. The room fell silent, eyes turning toward him. I could see the bride's face flicker, an almost imperceptible sign of panic, but she maintained her composure. That flicker was the crack in the dam, the tiny fissure through which all the hidden truths would eventually spill. I leaned closer to my grandson, whispering, "Everything has a beginning, and this is ours." As the spotlight moved to the stage for the performance my son had arranged, I slipped quietly toward the fallen envelope. My fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the anticipation of revelation. I lifted it, feeling the weight of secrets pressed between the paper, and I smiled to myself. Revenge is often best served in silence, and this was the perfect, quiet beginning. I could see the bride and her accomplice glancing nervously in my direction, unaware that I had already claimed the evidence that would expose them. Returning to my seat, I opened the envelope just enough to glimpse the contents. Names, dates, transactions, proof of betrayal so blatant it would make the audience gasp. I pressed the papers against my chest, the fire of righteous anger surging through me. It was not enough to simply confront them. The story needed to unfold publicly, leaving no room for excuses. I would let the world see the truth before the perpetrators could react. This was not cruelty, it was justice. And for my grandson, for the years of innocence stolen from my family, justice would be thorough and unrelenting. The first part of my plan was simple: observation and positioning. The second part would require subtle manipulation, planting doubts in the minds of the accomplices, watching them unravel from within. And the third part, oh, that was the most delicious of all, would be the public exposure. I could almost hear the gasp, the whispered conversations, the shifting of chairs as the house of cards collapsed. I glanced at my grandson, and he seemed to understand what was about to happen. He was too young to grasp the full scope, but he knew enough to trust me completely. That trust gave me strength I had not realized I still possessed. I sat back, letting the performance begin, but my mind never left the table, never left the envelope, and never left the slow, inevitable approach of justice. I had survived many storms in my life, and this one, disguised as a wedding, would be no different. I would navigate it with patience, cunning, and a grandmother's protective fury. And as the music played, I whispered under my breath, "This is only the beginning. The truth will be seen, and those who thought themselves untouchable will learn that even the smallest eyes can see everything, and the quietest hands can bring the heaviest consequences." The performance began, a soft melody filling the room, and for a moment, it seemed as though the wedding had returned to its surface of joy. But I knew better. I could feel the undercurrents, the lies hiding behind every polite smile, and I felt the weight of the envelope pressing against my chest like a secret too heavy to ignore. My grandson leaned closer to me, whispering, "Grandma, what will you do?" I smiled faintly, stroking his hair. "We wait," I said. "Patience makes the trap perfect." I watched the bride carefully, noting every subtle gesture, every nervous glance toward the accomplice seated near her. They believed themselves untouchable, secure in the illusion of secrecy. But the truth has a way of slipping through cracks, and that evening it was me who had learned to see every crack. I began my quiet work, positioning myself at the perfect angle to observe without being noticed. Every sip of my tea, every casual laugh, was a carefully calculated act, masking the storm that had already begun to gather in my mind. Revenge, after all, is not only about action, it is about control, timing, and psychological advantage. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The bride excused herself to the restroom, her accomplice following shortly after, glancing around to ensure nobody saw them leave together. My grandson and I waited just long enough, letting them disappear into the hallways, before I quietly slipped from my seat. The envelope was tucked safely in my purse, a treasure trove of betrayal that I could reveal when the time was right. But first, I had to set the stage, make sure the consequences would hit with maximum force. I followed them at a distance, careful to remain unseen, and watched as the accomplice whispered urgently, handing something to the bride. I recognized the panic in their movements, a panic born of the certainty that something was going wrong, though they could not yet see what. That panic was my ally. I had no intention of confronting them directly yet. The elegance of revenge lies in letting the guilty unravel themselves, exposing every lie, every scheme, without lifting a finger to force it. Returning to the main hall, I took my seat again, letting my grandson know that all was proceeding according to plan. The ceremony continued around us, guests laughing and clinking glasses, oblivious to the storm brewing silently in the background. My heart pounded with anticipation. I could feel it in my veins. This was not just about my son's wedding, or even about the betrayal we had discovered. It was about teaching a lesson so profound that the guilty would remember it for the rest of their lives. And I would teach it carefully, artfully, as only a grandmother who had lived long enough to know every trick could. As the night progressed, subtle opportunities presented themselves. The bride returned to the table, her composure fraying slightly, and I noticed the accomplice's eyes flick toward me once or twice, suspicion growing too late. They didn't know that I had already seen everything, collected the evidence, and begun the process of quiet exposure. My grandson squeezed my hand again, his small voice barely audible. "Grandma, is it ready?" I whispered. "Almost patience. Wait just a little longer." Then came the first break in their armor. The accomplice, growing desperate, leaned toward the bride, speaking so quietly that only I could hear. Words like "don't let her see," and "we'll fix it later" floated across the air. I pretended to sip my tea, but inside I was smiling. That single whisper confirmed everything I had suspected. Their plan, carefully constructed over months, was already unraveling because I had chosen the perfect moment to observe. And once unraveling begins, it does so quickly, leaving no chance for recovery. The bride's eyes met mine for the briefest moment, a flicker of recognition that perhaps I had seen what I was not supposed to. But I smiled warmly, a grandmotherly gesture, masking the full force of the storm I was about to unleash. That smile, that small act of patience, would be their undoing. I knew that in their panic, mistakes would multiply, and soon, they would be unable to contain the truth. Every lie, every deceit would spill into the open. By the time the first dance concluded, I had made my plan. The envelope, the whispers, the hidden panic. All of it would converge in a single moment that no one could ignore. My grandson, sensing my focus, stayed close, trusting me as if I were the only anchor in a world suddenly filled with hidden dangers. I whispered once more, "Soon the truth will speak, and everyone will see the consequences of betrayal." Even as the room erupted into applause for the newlyweds, I felt a cold satisfaction. The groundwork had been laid. The web was ready to tighten. Revenge is not a matter of brute force. It is the art of letting the guilty lead themselves into exposure while the observer, calm and unshaken, watches the inevitable collapse. And tonight, in that hall filled with laughter and music, the collapse was already beginning. By the time the speeches began, I knew the moment for the first subtle strike had arrived. I watched carefully as friends and family offered their congratulations, all oblivious to the storm beneath the surface. My grandson leaned close, whispering, "Grandma, will they know?" I smiled faintly. "They will, but not yet. We let them fall themselves." That was the key. Revenge is most effective when the guilty cannot blame anyone but themselves. I had learned this long ago, and tonight it would play out perfectly. As the best man stepped forward, I noted the bride's eyes flicker nervously, a small tremor in her smile. She thought she had controlled everything, but control is fragile, easily broken by the tiniest spark. And sparks, my dear grandson, are exactly what I plan to create. I subtly shifted in my seat, pretending to sip my drink while discreetly slipping a photograph from the envelope onto my lap. Not a full reveal, not yet, just enough to catch the eye of anyone who might notice. And the bride's face paled the instant she glimpsed it from across the hall. That reaction was my first small victory, and it sent a delicious shiver through me. The accomplice, sensing danger, leaned forward as if to cover for her, whispering something urgent. But in their anxiety, they did not notice the way their hands fumbled, the way notes and documents shifted carelessly on the table. I had spent years observing human behavior, learning that panic is the truest form of confession. The more one tries to hide, the more obvious the lies become. And as I watched, I could feel my grandson's hand tighten around mine, understanding the tension without needing words. Then the bride rose again, this time to pour champagne, and her nerves betrayed her completely. Her hand shook slightly, and I noticed the tiny slip of paper that fell from her clutch, the one she had tried so hard to retrieve before. I did not move immediately, letting the slip remain where it lay, a small breadcrumb of her deceit. I watched as she glanced around nervously, unaware that the rest of the hall's attention had not yet caught her mistake. The accomplice bent slightly, apparently to pick it up, but hesitated, and that hesitation revealed everything. I leaned closer to my grandson, whispering, "Now watch them unravel." The boy's eyes widened, realizing that the calm grandmother he thought he knew was quietly orchestrating something far greater than any story he had ever heard. The envelope in my purse, the photograph, the slip of paper, all of these were tools carefully timed like pieces in a game of chess. And just like that, I had the opening I needed. A cousin of my son, curious and perceptive, noticed the paper on the floor and bent down to pick it up. As she straightened, the room shifted. Eyes turned. Guests murmured. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the drama unfold naturally. The bride's color drained from her face, the accomplice's jaw tightened, and my son, my poor son, still remained blissfully unaware, smiling at his new bride with the innocence of someone who cannot yet see the danger. But the world was changing around him piece by piece, and I was the quiet force behind it all. The cousin read the paper aloud, assuming it was a misplaced note or a trivial wedding list, but her voice faltered as the contents became clear. Names, numbers, evidence of transactions that had nothing to do with celebration and everything to do with betrayal. Gasps echoed across the room. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The bride's hand flew to her mouth, and the accomplice froze, realizing for the first time that their carefully hidden secrets were now exposed in plain sight. I leaned back in my chair, calm as ever, letting them face the first taste of the consequences they had brought upon themselves. My grandson, ever perceptive, whispered, "Grandma, they're scared." I nodded slowly. "Yes, my dear. And this is only the beginning. Revenge is a process, not an event. The public reveal is the first act. The unraveling of power, the exposure of lies, the humiliation, these are the acts that follow. And tonight, they would learn that a grandmother's patience is a force to be reckoned with. that years of observation, experience, and love for her family can turn into a weapon sharper than any sword. The bride and her accomplice tried to speak, tried to offer explanations, but the room had already shifted. Friends and family exchanged wary glances, whispers spreading like wildfire. The accomplice's face reddened with panic, and the bride's smile faltered completely. They had underestimated me, underestimated a grandmother who had seen enough of the world to know that appearances are fragile, and that the truth, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. And in that moment, I felt a cold satisfaction that only comes from knowing justice, long delayed, has finally begun. The room buzzed with whispers, hushed exclamations, and the shifting of chairs as guests tried to process what had just been revealed. My son still remained unaware, caught in the fog of his own happiness, but that would not last. The bride's face, once painted with calculated joy, now flickered with desperation. The accomplice leaned closer, whispering feverishly, attempting to salvage some control, but every word betrayed them further. Panic has a way of magnifying guilt, and I could feel it radiating across the table like a storm's electric charge. I smiled faintly, stroking my grandson's hair. "See? They are already unraveling," I whispered. As the bride tried to regain composure, she attempted to redirect the attention with a forced toast. But her voice faltered, cracking under the weight of fear and the knowledge that the room's perception of her had shifted irreversibly. I could see it in the eyes of our guests: suspicion, curiosity, the dawning realization that all was not as it seemed. I leaned back in my chair, appearing calm, unshaken, but my mind was a whirlwind of strategy. I knew that mere exposure was not enough. The guilty must be broken carefully, step by step, until their deceit was completely laid bare. The accomplice, noticing the growing attention, made a bold but reckless move. He tried to intercept the evidence, leaning over my grandson's small figure in a feigned gesture of concern. But it was too late. His panic was palpable, and every movement he made only reinforced the truth in everyone else's eyes. I placed my hand gently on my grandson's shoulder, guiding him slightly to the side, shielding him without revealing my own awareness. Children are intuitive, and he understood instinctively that he must remain silent, watch, and trust me. Then, as the bride began to speak again, fumbling for words, I decided it was time to escalate. I allowed the envelope in my purse to peek out ever so slightly, just enough for a few perceptive eyes in the room to notice. That subtle gesture was like a spark in dry tinder. The moment they saw it, curiosity ignited. Guests began to whisper among themselves, leaning closer, straining to see what the secret might be. I let them, because panic spreads faster than any accusation, and once it has momentum, it becomes unstoppable. My grandson tugged gently at my sleeve. "Grandma, will they be punished?" I looked down at him, meeting his innocent, trusting eyes. "Yes, my dear," I whispered, "but punishment must be fair. They must face the consequences of their actions, and they must see that no lie remains hidden forever." He nodded solemnly, as though understanding far more than a boy his age should, and I felt a surge of protectiveness. He was the reason for everything, the reason that justice would be served today, no matter how long it took. The bride's panic grew. Her carefully maintained poise crumbled, and I noticed her hand tremble as she reached for the accomplice, perhaps seeking reassurance or plotting her next move. But it was futile. The evidence was already out, the room already questioning, and the accomplice's attempts to manipulate reality were collapsing under the weight of truth. I could see the desperation radiating from them, each gesture betraying a lifetime of cunning and deceit. This is the beauty of revenge carefully orchestrated. The guilty unravel without realizing that the observer, calm and patient, has orchestrated every step. I decided it was time for the next step. With deliberate care, I allowed a copy of the key evidence to slip into the hands of another relative, someone who had always been skeptical of the bride and her intentions. That subtle act ensured that the truth would spread, not just through observation but through action, leaving no room for excuses. The accomplice noticed, panic widening his eyes, but by then it was too late. Every move they made only tightened the noose. They had played a dangerous game, thinking themselves untouchable, and now the trap had sprung. As the evening continued, the atmosphere shifted. Laughter and music still attempted to mask tension, but beneath the surface, suspicion and fear rippled through the crowd. I watched my son, still smiling, still unaware, and I felt a pang of sorrow. He had chosen poorly, allowed deceit into his life, and yet he remained innocent in this moment, oblivious to the betrayal surrounding him. I promised silently that he would learn, but that his learning would be guided, not destroyed. He would see the consequences without being consumed by them, and my grandson would remain safe. By the time dinner concluded, the bride and her accomplice were visibly shaken. They whispered frantic words, moved nervously, and attempted subtle maneuvers to regain control. But every glance, every gesture, every faltering word only exposed them further. I remained calm, patient, a grandmother in appearance, but a force of justice in intent. The first act of revelation had succeeded. The second act, complete unraveling, was ready to begin. And I could feel it in my veins, the quiet thrill of knowing that the storm I had prepared for decades was now fully in motion, ready to leave no deceit unpunished. By now, the tension in the hall was thick enough to taste. Guests had begun to exchange glances, murmuring quietly as the pieces of the puzzle slowly revealed themselves. I could see the bride's smile falter with every passing second, the carefully constructed facade crumbling before my eyes. The accomplice's confident posture had collapsed into stiff anxiety, their whispered plans failing to mask the truth. My grandson sat quietly beside me, sensing the growing chaos, his small hand clutching mine tightly. "Grandma, they're scared," he whispered. I nodded, squeezing his hand gently. "Yes, my dear. And soon everyone will see why." It was time for the next move. Slowly, deliberately, I removed the envelope from my purse, letting its edge peek out where anyone attentive could see. My eyes met the bride's across the room, and in that instant I understood the panic she felt. The accomplice, noticing the subtle gesture, leaned forward, a mix of fear and calculation crossing his face. But it was too late. The evidence was in motion now, moving from hand to hand, creating a chain reaction that would leave no one able to deny the truth. Revenge is not only about exposure, it is about timing, and tonight the timing was perfect. I allowed a small gasp to escape me as I accidentally dropped a photograph onto the table. The image was enough, subtle, yet revealing. The guests nearest to me leaned forward, eyes widening as they caught sight of the document. Conversations froze mid-word, whispers died abruptly, and the room shifted. I could feel the panic radiating from the bride and her accomplice as they realized that the chain reaction had begun. Every calculated move they had made over months was collapsing in real time, and the fear in their eyes was the sweetest confirmation of justice. My grandson watched with wide eyes, understanding that this was a story unlike any bedtime tale. I whispered to him, "Patience, my dear. The storm has begun, but it is not yet over." The boy nodded solemnly, feeling the gravity of the moment without fully comprehending it. Children are sensitive to truth, and he knew instinctively that the grandmother who had protected him all his life was now orchestrating the final act. I allowed a slow smile to touch my lips, letting the guilty feel that tension as they tried desperately to regain control. The accomplice attempted to retrieve the photograph, but his hands trembled. His whispered protests fell on deaf ears. The guests were already noticing, curiosity and suspicion igniting like wildfire. I allowed my voice to rise slightly, a gentle question to a nearby relative about a detail on the paper. That small act was enough to draw attention to the evidence, and the chain of realization accelerated. The bride's face went pale, her lips parting in a silent gasp as she realized the meticulous trap had fully ensnared her. I watched my son finally notice the tension. Confusion flashed across his face as he glanced around, trying to understand the sudden hush and the worried glances of family members. I leaned closer to my grandson and whispered, "Soon he will understand, but he will not be harmed. He will see and he will learn." The boy's fingers tightened around mine, a small anchor of trust in a world suddenly filled with chaos. My heart swelled with protective pride. Then came the moment of total exposure. I stood slowly, letting the movement draw attention naturally, and held the photograph up slightly so that the contents were visible to anyone who cared to see. Murmurs escalated into audible gasps. I began to speak softly, just loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. Some secrets are best revealed before they destroy everything they touch. My voice carried the weight of authority, and the room fell into stunned silence, eyes following me. The bride's hand flew to her mouth, her accomplice froze, and my son's face paled as he finally grasped that his wedding day had been infiltrated by deceit. I continued, moving deliberately through the room, letting the evidence be seen by more guests. The accomplice tried to intercept, but it was too late. The dominoes had fallen. Guests leaned in, murmuring in disbelief, some whispering about months of suspicious behavior they had noticed but never connected. The bride's carefully constructed facade shattered completely. She could no longer hide behind charm or smiles. Every gesture now betrayed her panic, and every movement only confirmed the truth. My grandson whispered, "Grandma, they're caught." I nodded slowly, feeling the calm after the storm begin to settle in my chest. "Yes, my dear. But the storm is not yet over. There is more to be learned, and they will feel the consequences fully." I allowed a measured silence to stretch, letting the guilty contemplate the gravity of their actions. Revenge is not just in revelation. It is in letting the guilty fully feel their exposure, helpless to prevent it. By the end of that evening, the bride and accomplice were visibly shaken, isolated in a sea of questioning eyes. My son, still confused but beginning to understand, turned to me. I offered a comforting smile, the grandmother's face, calm and reassuring, masking the full force of the justice I had unleashed. "He will learn," I whispered again to my grandson, and he nodded, feeling the closure of innocence preserved while deceit crumbled around us. The air in the hall had grown heavy with tension, every whisper amplifying the fear radiating from the bride and her accomplice. I watched them now with a calmness that belied the storm I had created. My grandson sat close to me, eyes wide, clutching my hand tightly, feeling the gravity of what was unfolding. "Grandma, they can't escape, can they?" he whispered. I shook my head slowly. "No, my dear. Not now. They've led themselves straight into the trap." The bride's eyes darted frantically around the room, seeking some ally, some invisible hand that could save her from the humiliation that had already begun. The accomplice muttered something under his breath, a futile attempt at explanation or justification, but his voice was drowned out by the murmurs of the guests who were now fully aware of the betrayal. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. This was the power of patience, observation, and careful planning. Revenge, when executed properly, does not require rage. It only requires strategy. I rose from my seat, moving deliberately toward the center of the hall. The bride's face drained of color entirely, and the accomplice froze as if he had seen a ghost. I held the envelope in my hand, letting the evidence spill slightly so that everyone could see the contents without any words from me. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, broken only by the nervous shuffling of feet and the whispered gasps of realization. My grandson's small fingers tightened around mine, sensing that the final act was beginning. I spoke softly, my voice carrying the weight of decades of experience and quiet fury. "Some betrayals cannot remain hidden forever. The truth has a way of finding its way into the light, and those who thought themselves untouchable must face the consequences." The room remained silent, all eyes on me, and I let the words hang in the air like a noose around the guilty. The bride trembled visibly, her carefully constructed mask shattered, and the accomplice's posture slumped, defeated even before any formal confrontation had begun. Then, with deliberate calm, I invited a trusted family member to confirm the document's authenticity. The relative examined the contents, nodding slowly as the room's murmurs intensified. Evidence of manipulation, deceit, and hidden agendas became clear to everyone present. Gasps echoed across the hall, and the bride's lips parted in disbelief. The accomplice tried to whisper explanations, but their words fell flat, unheard, irrelevant. The truth had already spoken, and there was no turning back. I knelt slightly to my grandson, whispering, "Watch carefully. This is how justice looks when it is patient and precise." The boy nodded solemnly, absorbing the lesson silently. There is a time in life when innocence must witness consequence, when understanding cannot come without seeing the full scope of truth. And tonight my grandson was learning that lesson, not through fear, but through the certainty of justice executed with care. The bride's final attempts at manipulation crumbled completely. She turned to the accomplice, whispering frantically, but his face betrayed defeat. They realized, perhaps too late, that every scheme they had crafted, every lie they had told, had been catalogued, observed, and stored like ammunition by a grandmother who had survived far too much to be fooled. Their panic was now visible to everyone, and the whispers grew louder, carrying the weight of revelation to the far corners of the hall. I allowed myself to step back slightly, letting the crowd process what had been revealed. My son, still struggling to grasp the full extent of the betrayal, looked to me for guidance. I offered a reassuring smile, the calm, composed face of a grandmother protecting her family, while the fire of justice quietly burned beneath the surface. "He will understand soon enough," I whispered to my grandson, "and he will see the strength and patience and careful observation in standing up for what is right." The accomplice tried to retrieve the documents in desperation, but several relatives quickly intervened, ensuring the evidence remained in view. The bride's hand shook, and she sank into a chair, finally realizing the magnitude of exposure she faced. I watched every movement with the satisfaction of a strategist who had seen every piece fall exactly where it should. Revenge is not chaotic, it is methodical. And methodical tonight was proving devastatingly effective. By the end of the night, the bride and her accomplice had been stripped of all pretense. Their whispers, gestures, and deceit had been exposed to every guest. My son finally understood, confusion giving way to anger and then reflection. My grandson, sitting quietly beside me, watched the scene unfold, seeing the power of truth and patience firsthand. And I, the grandmother who had orchestrated it all, felt the weight lift slightly from my shoulders. Justice had been served, the innocent protected, and the guilty brought to account. The wedding hall, once filled with laughter and music, now vibrated with an uneasy silence. The bride and her accomplice sat rigid, their carefully crafted facades shattered completely. My son, finally piecing together the full magnitude of the betrayal, stood frozen, his face a mixture of shock, anger, and a dawning awareness of just how close disaster had come. I remained seated, calm, my hand resting lightly on my grandson's shoulder. The boy's eyes reflected both awe and understanding. "Grandma, did we win?" he asked softly. I smiled gently. "Yes, my dear. But the victory is more than just exposing lies. It is protecting our own and learning who truly deserves trust." The guests, still whispering, had begun to process what they had witnessed. Some approached cautiously, offering sympathetic glances and quiet words of support to my son. Others were curious, their eyes darting toward the bride and accomplice, now revealed as deceitful and unworthy of trust. The bride's posture sagged further, and the accomplice's jaw clenched with frustration and helplessness. They had underestimated the quiet, patient power of a grandmother who had lived long enough to see through every mask, every trick, every false smile. I watched my son slowly regain composure. His anger was tempered by realization, a mix of remorse for trusting too easily and gratitude that the betrayal had been revealed before it could do irreparable harm. He approached me quietly, a hesitant smile breaking through the tension. "Mommy, you saw it all?" he asked, his voice wavering. I nodded, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I saw enough, and I protected the ones who mattered most. Sometimes the truth must be revealed before we can truly heal." My grandson squeezed my hand, eyes shining. "Grandma, they won't hurt anyone else, right?" I smiled, feeling a wave of satisfaction mixed with relief. "No, my dear. They've learned the consequences of deceit, and they'll think twice before trying such tricks again. Justice isn't always about punishment. It's about teaching lessons so that harm cannot continue." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding in a way that only children of the observant can, and I felt proud of the courage and wisdom growing quietly within him. I glanced back at the bride and accomplice. Their whispered attempts at manipulation had failed completely, their schemes crumbling before an audience that had now fully realized the truth. Every smile, every word, every gesture was gone, replaced by panic, shame, and the bitter taste of exposure. I had orchestrated the entire sequence with precision, but I also knew that the most important part of revenge is ensuring it leaves no loose ends. That meant confirming that the deception would not quietly continue behind the scenes. I rose slowly, my movements deliberate, and approached the couple. "Your intentions were clear," I said softly but firmly, holding their gaze. "And so were your actions. Everyone here has seen it. I hope you understand that trust, once broken, cannot be repaired so easily. Learn from this if you can." My words were calm, but beneath them lay the weight of decades of observation, experience, and the power of a grandmother who would protect her family at any cost. They nodded stiffly, no words strong enough to defend themselves. Their downfall was complete and they knew it. Returning to my seat, I allowed the room to settle into quiet reflection. Guests who had witnessed the unraveling now whispered among themselves, sharing their shock and admiration for the way truth had been revealed. My son took my hand in his, a quiet gesture of gratitude, and I squeezed it gently. "Mom, you saved all of us," he said, finally understanding the magnitude of what had occurred. I smiled, shaking my head slightly. I only did what needed to be done. Remember, sometimes patience and observation are the greatest tools we have. My grandson leaned against me, exhaustion and mingling in his small features. "Grandma, can I tell the story someday?" he asked, voice barely audible. I chuckled softly, ruffling his hair. "Yes, my dear. But only when you understand that justice is not about anger. It is about protecting those you love and making sure that the truth is always seen." He nodded, eyes wide with understanding, and in that moment, I realized that the greatest victory of the evening was not the exposure of lies, but the lesson passed quietly to the next generation. By the time the reception finally ended, the bride and accomplice had been escorted away quietly, leaving the hall with the whispers of their downfall following them like shadows. My son, my grandson, and I remained, a quiet family strengthened by the ordeal. Justice had been delivered, innocence preserved, and lessons learned. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension leave my shoulders. Revenge had been patient, calculated, and precise, and it had worked exactly as it should. The hall was almost empty now, the echoes of shocked whispers fading into a quiet calm. My son stood beside me, still processing the events, while my grandson clung to my hand, wide-eyed and silent. The chaos of the evening had passed, leaving only the weight of truth, the lingering sense of justice served, and the comfort of family still intact. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of my grandson's small hand, and the reassurance that our family had survived the storm unscathed. I looked at my grandson and smiled gently. "Do you understand, my dear?" I asked softly. "Tonight you saw that patience, careful observation, and courage can protect those we love. You saw that justice does not always come quickly, but when it does, it must be deliberate and fair." He nodded solemnly, his small face illuminated by the soft lights of the hall. "Grandma, you were like a superhero," he whispered. I chuckled softly, brushing his hair from his forehead. "Not a superhero, my dear. Just someone who knows when to act and when to wait. That is a grandmother's power, quiet, patient, and unshakable." My son finally approached, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Mom, I don't know how to thank you. I didn't see it coming, and I would have been lost if not for you." I shook my head gently, smiling. "You don't need to thank me. I only did what was necessary. Remember this, my son, life will always test you. People will lie, betray, and manipulate. But with patience, observation, and integrity, you can protect yourself and those you love. That is the lesson of tonight." The bride and her accomplice were gone, leaving a room of stunned witnesses who had learned more than they expected. But for me, the evening was not just about exposing deceit. It was about passing on a legacy. My grandson, seeing the results of careful planning and justice served, was learning more than any storybook could teach. He learned that courage is not always loud, that revenge can be precise and purposeful, and that family is worth defending at all costs. I led my grandson to a quiet corner of the hall, away from lingering guests. "Look at this," I said, holding up the envelope, now empty save for the photographs and notes I had already revealed. "This is how truth works, my dear. You collect it, observe it, and use it only when necessary. Justice is not chaos, it is balance. And sometimes the quietest hands are the strongest." He studied my face, absorbing every word, and I knew that he had understood the essence of the lesson. My son joined us, finally calm, a look of relief softening his features. "Mom, you saved me and you taught me too," he said quietly. "I will never forget this, and I will never forget the lessons you've shown my son." I nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction settle in my chest. Revenge was not about malice. It was about protecting family, exposing deceit, and ensuring that innocence remained untainted. And tonight, that had been achieved flawlessly. As we prepared to leave, I glanced around the hall one last time. The whispers of the guests had turned into admiration for the way truth had been revealed, the way justice had been served without chaos or unnecessary harm. My grandson held my hand tightly, looking up at me with newfound respect and awe. "Grandma, will I be able to do this too someday?" he asked softly. I smiled, kneeling to his level. "Yes, my dear. But remember, the first step is patience. Observe, understand, and protect. Only then can you act with purpose. That is the greatest power you can ever have." Walking out into the cool night air, I felt the weight of the evening lift from my shoulders. My grandson skipped beside me, excited yet thoughtful, while my son followed, silent but grateful. The wedding had revealed betrayal, but it had also revealed resilience, courage, and the quiet power of a grandmother determined to protect her family. I knew that this night would be remembered not for the lies that were exposed, but for the lessons that were passed, for the justice that had been served with precision, and for the bond strengthened between 3 generations. As we drove home, my grandson leaned against me, eyes closing with fatigue and wonder. I held his small hand in mine, feeling the warmth of life and the certainty that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, our family could survive anything. "Tonight," I whispered softly, "you saw how truth and patience win over deceit and arrogance. Remember it always." He mumbled a sleepy, "I will, Grandma," and I knew that the lesson had taken root. By the time we arrived home, the city lights glittering faintly in the distance, I reflected on the events of the evening. Revenge had been achieved, but more importantly, justice had been served. My grandson had witnessed the quiet strength of wisdom and patience, and my son had learned the value of discernment. And I, the grandmother who had orchestrated it all, felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that family had been protected, deceit had been exposed, and lessons had been passed to the next generation with care and intention. Tonight, the world was right again, if only for us. I'm so happy that you took the time to listen to my story all the way through. Please let me know in the comments what you thought of it.